Understanding where to invest in AI is so crucial for shaping tomorrow's technology landscape. Please welcome Betsy Alexander-Chinai, CFO of Microsoft Middle East, and Saeed Murad, Senior Partner at Global Ventures, and Millie Liu, the founder and managing partner, First Star Ventures. They joined Jen Stave from D-Cube's Institute at Harvard to explore the future of AI investment. Their combined experience in corporate strategy, venture capital, and academic research offers a really comprehensive view of AI's investment landscape.
How's everyone doing? How is the energy? We have a hard task being second to last, but I promise we will be entertaining. So we've heard today that generative AI is reshaping everything, every function, every industry, and I think that's certainly true in the long term, but what about the short term? There's variation in where there's an impact. There's a quote that is often heard in the halls of D-Cubed by Kareem and others that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so what I want to know is in the short term, right now, where are we seeing the future? Where are we seeing things that are providing significant value, and where is it still lacking? More specifically, I'd love it if we could start off talking about where is generative AI overvalued and undervalued?
Well, sure, I can start. Millie Liu, I'm based in Boston, investing in deep tech. So there are actually not as many investors investing in deep tech as we do. So I'll say where is undervalued, there are definitely areas I'll say it might be a little bit higher barrier of entry for the investors even to understand like what AI is doing. And obviously, there's less capital who can access to that. So for some of the specific fields that I invest in, for example, with AI applications or generative AI applications in like structural biology, in structural chemistry, right? Like thinking of like how do you invent, design, and manufacture novel materials that didn't exist before, either the organic ones or the inorganic ones, right? If you think of, for example, there are about $10 trillion worth of chemical materials that can be biosynthesized. But then there are actually a lot of innovation that needs to, or waiting for AI or computing power so that it can disrupt with bioproduction. And that requires, for example, one of the speaker earlier talking about using computing power or AI for protein dynamic folding. It's just one simple aspect of creating or design novel proteins, right? And then if you think of like the inorganic material where the energy, some of the most critical elements of our society, even for survivalship, like the food, the energy sources, right? So we're actually investing a lot of the things that solving or addressing these critical problems where there might be some headlines, but actually not enough of investors who are actually either investing or understand enough to invest in it. One of the fields, for example, like nuclear fusion, just to give an example, that's actually where it requires a lot of AI and computing power to be able to bring what is now validated kind of scientific theory and bring it to like commercial scale in the next like 10 to 15 years. We also invest a lot into, for example, like ocean science, like in anything that's like water or like kind of weather forecasting, right? These are actually the areas that require even more computational resources than protein. So I think these are the fields that are super exciting, especially very relevant for this region, but probably just having a little bit less or getting a little bit less of attention because it is very deep technical fields.
And anything on the flip side where you think investments are going that potentially are overvalued?
I'll use the example of probably like LMs or some of the humanoid robots. Again, as an investor, we are paying for certain valuation given the risk-return profile, right? It's not about like if this will have the billion-dollar potential or change the world. As an investor, I really look at my risk return, like if it's well justified, right? Like these are definitely the fields where it is already creating a lot of value and also will definitely create a lot of value. But then if you look at the risk-adjusted returns, like if you have the certainty that you're investing into the leaders, go for it. But of course, that's also very much like judgment, right? But as a general industry, there probably more of a capital flowing into it without that certainty justified, but paying a very rich premium just because all the media headlines.
Other panelists? Saeed?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having us and great to be here. And for those of you still here, well done. Appreciate you staying behind. The only thing I would say is as investors, our role is to underwrite the risk-return profile. And so overvalued versus undervalued is a relative exercise. What some may consider overvalued, others may see a much wider and larger opportunity and may decide to double down and invest bigger in. Whereas others may see that an underwrite is going to be more challenging, and so they're actually going to have to step back and go at a lower valuation, if you will. I think the important thing to note is this is all dependent on market size, where you're investing, both sectorally and geographically. You need to be able to see a very, very sizable opportunity for you to have that sizable underwrite. Otherwise, it's the math will just not math.
Anything, Ted?
So I can take a slightly different slant to it. Since I'm not an active investor, I'm from a corporate kind of perspective. And I would say, Jen, you were talking about like the here and now. And I would say we saw the stats, right? Productivity, efficiencies, the high value, the gains that we're realizing that are being published, but I would say pushing that adoption, I still feel is very undervalued across the enterprise and maybe even on a personal side, and really just embracing a new way of working, a new way of running your meetings, a new way of engaging with content and exploring. I still think while we are captivated and we believe in those stats, really seeing companies and leaders drive that adoption and actually investing the time to really see that through and realize the benefits of that commercialization is still very nascent.
Yes, change is hard. Let's move to another question around specific industries or sectors. So coming from Harvard, we're clearly in the educational industry, and Clay Christensen, one of the founding scholars of disruptive innovation from Harvard Business School, he looked at the educational sector a decade ago and said that it was going to go into decline because of an archaic business model. And this has been exacerbated by generative AI. And so when you think about, that's clearly not the case today, but we know that change is coming. And when we think about some of the language we saw today where Harvard versus Stanford, you wonder how many years have to go by until that's us looking back at the debate between BlackBerry and Palm, right? I don't know, but I do know it's coming. We do have a senior associate dean in the audience, so maybe she's more optimistic that it's not coming. But we know that change will come to industries. And so again, focusing on the here and now, Harvard's still number one, so we know it's not education, but what industry do you think is significantly different today than 6 months ago, or what sector or geography, but bigger trends, where do you see the biggest disruption?
Happy to take that one. I'll start with this. The onset of generative AI specifically in a more democratized fashion since the launch effectively of ChatGPT has been an inflection point, essentially, but cross-industry. So what we're seeing a lot more of, and we've seen a lot of misconception in terms of treating AI as a vertical. It's not. It is very much ubiquitous, cuts cross-industry, cross-sector, cross-geography. It has been a true enabler and an accelerant to the way in which businesses are A, being built, or B, being adapted. And so what we see is businesses that are AI-led, coming in at an early stage with a very specific stack. We were discussing this earlier, a lot more, for example, that are building on Azure today because of the integrations with OpenAI and others. And so it's been a change in market approach, a change in market dynamic, and a change in core build from the ground up. But what we're also seeing is those that have built traditional tech stacks have to implement and integrate a new, if you want, AI-enabled model, which makes them more efficient, which makes them more effective, and allows them to catch up a little bit more. And so it's not about the disruption in terms of replacing, but rather enabling, making more efficient, making more effective, making more competitive. And for those that did not have this built in, having to make sure that what they are enabling and adding into their stacks and into their offerings can compete with what's being built from the ground up.
And so you wouldn't put more dollars into one industry versus another. You're just spreading it evenly.
We have a slightly different approach. I'll talk about global ventures specifically, where we're excited today, and for the markets in which we invest, which are the Middle East and Africa, we're seeing a massive opportunity in sectors like supply chain tech and agri-tech. We've historically been a thematic investor. In 2018, we saw a big opportunity in fintech, so we over-indexed on fintech in our early fund. Our second fund was a 2020 vintage. This will surprise all of you, but we over-indexed on digital health. And then on our current fund, we see supply chain tech and agri-tech as a massive opportunity. What we do is we actually run research. We will build out our theses. We actually publish our research. So here's a shameless plug, global.vc, and go to our research. Deep sectoral research on different sectors. We recently released a mobility and Middle East and Africa report. Prior to that, we did prop tech, we did supply chain tech, agri-tech, fintech, a whole bunch of different reports because we felt like the information was missing. But for us to be an investor that can actually put money to work effectively and efficiently, we need to really understand sectors in depth, understand the value chains, and then allocate accordingly. So I hope that answers your question.
Certainly.
I'm going to agree with Syed, not just because he mentioned Microsoft Azure, but we were talking about this as well in terms of it's really across functions, right? So whether it be HR or marketing, across any industry, any individual, any organization, we see the transformation happening. And if I just talk about a specific Microsoft example, I know Bobby mentioned GitHub and obviously what it's doing for engineers, but if we take pride on being customer zero of our AI, what we see actually happening in our customer service organization, right? And so when we realize efficiencies and we drive up customer engagement and we actually are able to realize cost benefits, as a CFO, I know our budgets are not increasing, right? But if we're able to take those costs out of the system and redeploy them and reinvest them towards, higher revenue or the investments we need towards AI, that's an example that we're witnessing dramatically in probably a year time span at Microsoft. So it's certainly a function where I see maybe some of our other functions within the company have to catch up on.
Millie, will you put your bet on an industry?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, we invest in across the board where AI or data algorithm computing disrupt pretty much every single industry. So we are vertical agnostic, and we definitely see, not just what we talk a lot about, how a lot of the organizations' efficiencies and like how organizations works, but then for us, like we actually focus on, a lot of the traditional industries that might be completely disrupted, like how things are done will be very, very different, right? So like, for example, we have companies in the more like energy space, and they are doing things, I'll give you one specific example in geothermal, right? Like they're doing things at like only basically for every $1 that their existing competitors that they're paying, like our portfolio companies only needs to pay 3 to 4 cents on it, right? And it's exactly because of that kind of AI native approach. And they're even like, for example, in the mobility space, right? If you talk about like autonomous driving, right? how autonomous driving was done like 10 years ago, if you look at the tech stack, it's actually very, very different from how it is done now. It's a lot more capital efficient. How you kind of generate tag, the data, how you train your model is actually completely different. If you look at any companies that started, let's say like back in like 2008, 2009, or 2018, 2019 versus like 2022, 2023, right? Like actually, the tech infrastructure is even different. They're all in the autonomous driving space. So, I mean, in our space, like with deep tech, you know, things probably move slightly slower. At the end of the day, we're working on like technology, but the innovation, it definitely happens in a very kind of continuous way. It's not just discrete. So, you know, things might seem slow within 6 months or 12 months, but then if you could take a step back, even in like 2 years or 3 years, actually it has changed significantly. And then, you know, in 5 years, you're seeing how the industry are doing things in a completely different way. So again, this is all like thanks to, or at least a good part of it, is thanks to the availability of data with the, you know, progress made on the algorithm and also with computing. Well, thanks to Microsoft and NVIDIA.
We'll invest there.
Well, I'm glad to hear no one said ed tech and you know, the move away from traditional universities. Let's talk about regulation. So when you think about investing, regulation introduces a pretty significant amount of uncertainty. Given the global diversity, given that it is still very much in flux in this new world. And you know, we have the benefit of a very strong partnership with Microsoft, and Satya Nadella is on our advisory council. He also visits Harvard frequently. And it was about two years ago, he gave a speech at Harvard Business School where he mentioned that you know, regulation, like incumbents love it, right? Because what it does is it drives the cost of entry up for new companies to come and disrupt. And so I'm going to call on you first on this one, Betsy, as the representative from Microsoft. Tell us what's your stance on it?
Well, I definitely cannot disagree with the big boss, so on record. But okay, yes, for sure there's new parameters and processes and requirements and probably investments to comply with regulation. But I would say in the age of AI, where we have to accept the reality of misuse and malicious activity, and that is on the rise, I do believe regulation helps earn trust, right? And a fundamental, putting aside the competitive aspect that Microsoft runs on, is trust. But with AI, I think we need to have clarity, right, on the principles that should support that regulation. I think there was a point earlier whether those principles are universal. With how we've outlined it as a company, there are 6 pretty much pervasive ones. I do believe that they are pervasive, right? If you think about fairness, reliability, safety, privacy and security, inclusion, transparency, and accountability, I do think that those are unrefuted principles that we need to uphold. But even as an incumbent, we are having to invest, right? Our leadership sets the tone, our board sets the tone, but we've actually invested in a responsible for AI office, right? That actually works in collaboration with industry and policymakers to help, I think, chart the way forward, right? Because we have to have guidelines, and it's not super clear yet, but we need those guidelines in terms of how these AI systems should be built, as well as how users should interact with them. I do think that governance is essential, right? While we strive to be, right, still the incumbent and the leader in AI, I do think if you look at it from a different competitive aspect, there is probably on a human aspect a large agreement that it's really important for the industry and the transformation.
Great. Millie, Saeed, how is the regulatory landscape affecting your investment decisions?
Yeah, I think, if it's more for kind of general, like AI compliance, AI regulation, sure, like generally, given the burden of complying to these new and up-and-coming regulations, then startup is definitely at disadvantage compared to big corporates. But then there are also like another side to it. For example, let's say in the healthcare space, right? Like we have portfolio company founders who they actually kind of pull together like an industry coalition, and because this whole kind of AI for healthcare or medical usage is all relatively new, right? And then so these startup founders, including some of the big companies, they're like, hey, let's as industry first figure out like what is the ethical thing to do, what's the right and wrong, and also because it is understandable that the regulators, they tend to be a little bit behind in terms of understanding the latest and best technology. So why don't the industry leaders who are technical, who come from the industry background, who are on the front line every day, so why don't we first, it's almost like a little bit self-regulating, right? Like so that when we're always like in continuous or constant communication with the regulator, say, hey, I know you guys are not quite ready yet regulating us, but then this is what we're doing on our own. And then when it's the time to think about like putting the laws and passing the bills, like these are the best practices. Like we have already been doing this for a while, and then like this is how you should think about regulating us, right? And there's also another part up to it is, for example, with the IP law, right? It is challenging for, again, the regulators or even anyone to think about like, wow, was this completely new technology, or let's say like a new kind of protein or molecular structure, right? Is this a discovery from the nature that, is just, it cannot be patented? Or if you're engineering it a little bit, then now like the engineering part, it should be patented. So then this is what the startup or the company or innovation, there's pulling hundreds of millions or $1 billion in the industry to innovate on, and they should be patented and protected. And actually, as VC investors, we do even rely on a lot of those patents to be acquired by much bigger company as our exit pathway, right? And then, like how much of engineering, like if you only engineer for 5% versus like 10% versus 15%, that's like significant different from like the last version someone else has done or what you discover from the nature, right? There are a lot of nuances, and it's definitely not a clear answer like yes or no, where's the line? And especially with like the AI data computing, it is driving more and more these novel innovations that nobody has ever thought about, and definitely not the regulators. And it is very challenging. It's not, I don't envy their job. It's not an easy job to think about like, how do I think of all these new innovation inventions? By like either making sure they're doing the right thing, but also like protecting them, making sure that there is a patentable value, so that these companies, let's say if they get into some sort of like IP war, then the innovation is actually protected and therefore encouraged.
Wonderful. Saeed?
Hey man, I think a lot has been said, but the approach I'll take towards this is innovation will always push boundaries. In pursuit of quote unquote blue ocean, you're always going to try to find new areas, explore new areas, push the envelope. Guardrails are important, and it's important to make sure that you're operating within that sphere. But to enable the guardrails to flex along with innovation, you need dialogue. And so a continuously open dialogue, being able to liaise with the right people, the decision makers, those that set, or lawmakers or set regulation, it is an important aspect. If you think towards an asset class like, for example, digital assets, Dubai was one of the first to pioneer with VARA and create the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority around it. And so this was a global first. Similarly, what you see with asset classes like fintech, for example, is a more progressive approach. CB UAE has a chief fintech officer to ensure that there's this continuous thinking and dialogue around how can we continue to push the envelope, how can we drive innovation, how can we continue to foster growth. And so it is important to keep that in mind as you think through the guardrails that do exist, but also how you're able to push the boundaries and help those guardrails expand and accommodate new technologies, new approaches, and an innovative world.
Great, and we have about 3 minutes left, so perhaps rapid fire. Tell us what you're watching, either for inspiration or for ideas, or where you think something exciting is going to happen. It can be specific company, we can all go invest in when we leave, or it can be, a trend. But tell us, what are you watching right now?
I'll definitely say the region, right? So I've been in the region for 10 years now, and when I first joined to where I am now, in terms of seeing the leadership, the innovation, the strategic partnerships that we're doing here that really are going to power and develop IT that we're going to see in, transform emerging markets and even some of the developed market and industries. So the UAE in particular, I think, is at such a forefront, and also went back to the regulation point, right? They are willing to explore and wanting to be world leaders, even in influencing some of those guidelines. So I think it is a very holistic approach that we're seeing, particularly in the market.
Again, there's across the board that I'm all very excited, but I guess especially for this region, a lot of things that we invest in, for example, like material science, agriculture, like climate-oriented technologies, especially we're seeing a lot of kind of pull from the governments in this region. What can be just like good to have elsewhere, but in this region, it can be a kind of national security level of priority, right? So we're excited, we're in conversations with some different parts of the governments where they are a lot more open to, for example, designating kind of test bed for whatever new technologies in their designated zones, so that they can experiment with technology versus us sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, waiting for the Cambridge government to give us a license to put on our autonomous driving cars, or some sort of bioengineered new seeds, or in the field. That would take forever, or working with environmental protection agency, right? But the kind of conversations we're having now with this part of the world is actually super exciting, and we definitely look forward to working with more adaptable, more open-minded, and agile government bodies, where they see the urgency of adopting new technology, and also, I guess, in a way, because everything is relatively new, so they can they don't have to think about the incumbent, right? They can be much more open-minded with the latest and the best.
Great. Saeed, you get the last 30 seconds.
I'll just add on to what Betsy said earlier. The region, absolutely. But also watch out for a trend of the region building globally innovative and globally competitive companies coming from the region servicing global problems. I'll say from our portfolio, at least, over 20% of our portfolio now has revenues, a higher portion of revenues, out from markets like the West than they do in the region. And so they're starting to build out in the region, dominating in the region, and able to expand and provide globally competitive solutions. And so watch this space.
Great. Well, thank you very much all for your insights. And thanks, everyone. We have one panel left. We all have a head full of knowledge, so thanks so much.